Welcome to Asian Horizon. In this program, I want to reflect on the G7 summit's agreement to develop infrastructure around the world, which clearly also is a challenge to China. And I also want to compare and see if the G7 countries are going to be able to develop infrastructure as China is doing with its One Belt, One Road strategy. And I think in reality, we're not going to see the G7 countries collectively develop a global infrastructure strategy as China has. But what we're probably going to see is independent G7 countries and companies from various G7 countries developing and planning infrastructure around the world. But to see G7 countries collectively doing it, I don't think is likely. First of all, the US after the Cold War did not develop infrastructure in any countries. And currently, the US is not really building infrastructure in any countries around the world. In fact, Central America, which is the most challenging region for the US currently with the refugee crisis on the US border, strongly and urgently needs a lot of new infrastructure investments to really develop and grow as an economic region. But the US hasn't done anything really to develop infrastructure even in Central America, which is the closest region to the US that really needs infrastructure. Therefore, in reality, are we going to see that the G7 countries collectively are going to invest up to $1,500 or $2,000 billion, such as China is doing with its One Belt, One Road strategy, investing in infrastructure around the world? I don't think that's likely. In addition, to develop infrastructure as China is doing with its One Belt, One Road strategy, that requires a lot of, relations with various countries and a geopolitical balancing act, which China is able to do. The US, as we know, has challenging relations with many countries. For example, Russia and China and various countries in the Middle East. To see the US developing infrastructure in these countries is just not likely. In addition, Africa needs infrastructure really now going forward. And there's a strong need for much more infrastructure, even if China is building a lot of infrastructure right now. Therefore, but I don't think it's likely to see, the G7 countries, collectively developing an infrastructure strategy around Africa. I just don't think it's likely to happen. But we're probably going to see independent countries such as Japan, maybe Britain, and other countries and companies from these countries developing infrastructure in Africa and other regions. Where we're probably going to see, as was agreed upon on the G7 summit, is, for example, investments in 1 billion vaccine doses, which is going to be distributed. That will be an initiative that is an important initiative from the G7 countries. In terms of digital infrastructure in the poorest countries around the world, what is most urgently needed now is physical infrastructure, physical telecom infrastructure, etc., in terms of building also digital capacity. But first of all, there is a need for physical infrastructure. And that goes again back to my first argument that I don't think it's likely that we're going to see a major global strategy growing out of the G7 countries going forward collectively. But these are just some thoughts. But again, I think that we're going to see China is going to continue its One Belt, One Road strategy despite the corona pandemic. In fact, I think the corona pandemic has just strengthened China's resolve to continue its One Belt, One Road strategy. And it's really urgently needed because there are so many countries that really need infrastructure going forward. Well, thank you so much for joining. And I do look forward to see you again on Asian Horizon. And please remember to subscribe. Thank you.